Alright guys, so to move on in our English post-colonial literature studies course, multicultural Britain I've called it a few times as well, you are going to do a flipped classroom version of Vola Soyinka's famous poem Telephone Conversation from 1963. Yeah, just listen to me, listen to the video, and then you have to switch slides in the end in bent spaces and answer some of the questions, and then we'll do some quizzes on the class. So Wole Soyinka, the poet. Soyinka was born in Isara, Nigeria on July 13, 1934. As a child, he became increasingly aware of the pull between African tradition and Western modernization. He's lived in Nigeria, the United States of America, and England. Soyinka was the first African to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. And he is also, well, in his authorship, he has become famous for exploring the schism and the chasm, the gulf between traditional African ways of doing things, of dealing with things, and on the other side of the gulf, if you can say that, the modern, and in this instance, modern England. Soyinka came to England as a young man from Nigeria in the late 1950s. Nigeria had just recently gained independence from England, and the events in the poem relate to this period, when there were no laws to prevent landlords, people renting out their homes or renting out flats, from discriminating against ethnic groups when renting out houses or flats. Mind you, such laws do exist today. Some of the themes, well, when we read poetry, when we read a poem, what we would usually do first is sort of have a general look, a general idea of the theme before we sort of back our ideas up with the specific lines from the text or examples. So in Telephone Conversation, the poet conveys, he sort of lets us know about his disappointment and anger about being discriminated against just because he's an African, by portraying the telephone conversation between himself and the British landlady. So it's not because there is particularly difficult glossary or particularly difficult words in the poem, but some of the words he uses in sort of interesting and maybe for you new ways. So indifferent, in this instance, it means having no particular interest or concern, apathetic. Then there's a word like rancid in line 12, rancid, which means having a disagreeable odor, smell, or taste of decomposing oils or fats. Rank is another English word, rancid and rank. In Danish we would say harsk, like rancid butter, harsk smør. Squelching, line 14, to crush as if trampling on, stepping on, squash, you squash something. Then there's a word like dumbfoundment, in line 16, dumbfoundment, which means filled with astonishment and perplexity, surprise. Then there's a difficult word, sort of a science word. It's called a spectroscopic. It's in line 23. It means to utilize a device to observe different aspects of color, nuances. So how black is something, how yellow is something, what kind of red is it? Then we have a saying, an idiom, flight of fancy. It's also an alliteration, a rhyme and a rhythm on the first letter F, flight of fancy, which means an imaginative exploration. So it's sort of trying to explore something with your imagination. Peroxide blonde, in line 30, the color of hair that has been bleached with hydrogen peroxide, meaning very, very white hair. Alright, I'm going to read the poem for you, try to follow up while I read it, try to follow the lines while I read them. I won't do any voices, so I'm just reading them in my normal voice. As it is a conversation, you could act out the conversation making an African voice and a very English voice, but I won't do that. So, the price seemed reasonable. Location, indifferent. The landlady swore she lived off premises. Nothing remained but self-confession. Madam, I warned, I hate a wasted journey. I am African. Silence. Silenced transmission of pressurized good breeding. Voice, when it came, lipstick coated, long gold rolled cigarette holder piped. Caught I was, foully. How dark? I had not misheard. Are you light or very dark? Button B, button A, stench of rancid breath of public hide and speak. Red booth, red pillar box, red double-tiered omnibus, squelching tar. It was real, shamed by ill-mannered silence. Surrender pushed dumbfoundment to beck simplification. Considerate she was, varying the emphasis. Are you dark or very light? Revelation came. You mean like plain or milk chocolate? Her accent was clinical, crossing in its light impersonality. Rapidly, wavelength adjusted, I chose West African sepia, and as an afterthought, down in my passport. Silence for spectroscopic flight of fancy, till truthfulness clanged her accent, hard on the mouthpiece. What's that? Conceding. Don't know what that is. Light brunette. That's dark, isn't it? Not altogether. Facially I'm a brunette, but madam, you should see the rest of me. Palm of my hand, soles of my feet are peroxide blonde. Friction, caused foolishly, madam, by sitting down has turned my bottom raven black. One moment, madam, sensing her receiver rearing on the thunderclap about my ears. Madam, I pleaded, wouldn't you rather see for yourself? So, what's going on in this poem? The caller's interested in renting a house, obviously. Instead of talking something about the price and things concerning the house renting, installations, is there a TV, whatever, the two speakers talk about their skin color. This issue is brought up by the landlady at first. The use of the pun of the word indifferent shows the intention of the landlady. Remember, pun is a play on word. From the word indifferent, the landlady seems not too aware who her house is rented to. However, she does care. She asks the caller, are you light or very dark? Which shows us that she is determined not to rent her house to an African. She is obviously discriminating against the caller. Sorry for the misspelling here. It is then the man decides not to rent the house. But instead of letting the woman know how dark he is directly, he plays word tricks on the woman. The poet, in that manner, in that way, describes the woman as lipstick-coated, long gold-rolled cigarette holder piped, and it seems that the woman is wealthy and well-educated. But this is meant to be taken ironically. From the outlook of the woman, it seems that the poet wants to get across the idea that the woman is good and considerate. However, the poet actually wants to point out the outlook of a person doesn't mean anything. The woman is actually arrogant and impolite in the view of the poet. The most sarcastic point is that the woman does not understand what the man means when he says sepia and brunette, which both mean very dark in color. From the words the persona uses, he wants to convey that racism is not fair in the society. The Caucasian, meaning a white Western woman, is judging the African as low class and uneducated only by looking at their appearance. Listening. However, the persona simply plays word tricks on the woman, and although it's a bit rude, it shows that the Africans can be more educated, well-mannered even, than the woman who is white. The poet reinforces the point that Africans deserve equal status in the British society. In the last part of the poem makes use of humor because the woman does not seem to understand what he's talking about. The persona asks the woman if she wants to look at his whole body to see if it is entirely black in color, and he particularly states that his bottom is raven black, meaning of course his arse. So, reverting back to theme. So what is the topic? that the poem addresses? What do we learn about the subject and the topic? Good, bad, indifferent? What idea does the poet, the author, want us to take away from the poem? So, in general, when speaking of poetry, we will almost always start by asking this very, very general question. What does the poem say about the human experience, human motivation, and the human condition? Remember, when we speak of poetry, well, this is sort of a part of human studies, so it's got something to do with emotions, with the matters of the heart rather than matters of the intellect. It's a fairly interesting structure. It's a first-person point of view. There's only one stanza, one paragraph, and it's free verse, meaning there's no particular rhyme or rhythm pattern. It's just one long conversation. Why is that then? Well, first of all, the conversation is not planned. How could it be? There's a sense of random formation, which connects well to the way in which a telephone conversation would normally flow. So it seems authentic in a way, real. Things to consider, in general, but also specifically for this poem. What's the tone? What is the atmosphere of the poem? And considering semantics, particular words. Why does Vole Soyinka use so many words which are associated with color? Try to find them in the text. You'll be asked to later on anyway. And then alliteration, sort of the only real poetic means that he uses. Alliteration, do you remember? A flight of fancy with the letter F. Bogstavrim, we say in Danish. You can almost always connect any work of art to another work of art. So this poem is mainly about prejudice and discrimination. I'm sure you've seen films, you've read novels, you've read other poems, you've heard about works of art dealing with these two topics. But it's also about how people sometimes learn hard lessons from their experience. In this instance, the landlady learned something about herself, probably. Perhaps not. But certainly the African, the caller, the persona, he learned something about racism in English society. Thank you. Now I would ask you to move on and answer the next slide in blank spaces.